The shock is not what the title implies. It is not the dramatic revelation of someone's hidden feelings suddenly surfacing, not the avoidant's inevitable return, not the universe conspiring to bring two people back together because the connection was real enough to survive the silence. The actual shock is quieter than any of that, more personal, more interior. The shock is what you discover about yourself when the dynamic finally, genuinely, from both sides, goes still. When both people stop reaching. When the no contact is genuinely mutual, rather than one person withdrawing while the other maintains orientation. Something becomes available that the active dynamic was never quiet enough to reveal. The actiony texture of your own interior without the dynamic as its organizing principle. Not the performed version, not the deliberately constructed without the avoidant version of the self that strategic no contact tries to produce. The actual, genuine, what is actually here version of a person who has been in an emotionally consuming dynamic and is now, for the first time, simply in their own life without the dynamic's ambient presence organizing the interior's background activity. That discovery is the shock, not the avoidance behavior, your own interior. What tends to be discovered varies genuinely from person to person, is not predictable from the outside, and should not be prescribed by a script. But there are honest things that can be said about what the mutual silence tends to reveal. It reveals the actual volume of the dynamic's consumption. During the active phase, the empath's considerable interior resources were significantly allocated to the dynamic, the monitoring, the interpreting, the hoping, and the generous reading and the sustained investment in the connection's possibility. These allocations were real and ongoing, and because they were the ambient condition of the interior rather than the deliberate expenditure of a discrete project, their actual volume was difficult to accurately perceive from inside them. The mutual silence makes the volume visible by removing it. The interior that was previously always partially occupied becomes gradually, genuinely less occupied, and the specific quality of what was occupying it becomes retroactively apparent through the specific quality of what its absence produces: space. Not the dramatic, liberating space of a burden lifted, the quieter, more genuine, gradually more available space of interior resources returning to the person who is spending them. That space does not immediately fill with obvious nourishment. This is worth being honest about. The early period of genuine mutual silence tends to have a specific quality that is neither the comfort of resolution nor the acute pain of fresh loss. It is the specific quality of genuine emptiness, not the emptiness of meaninglessness, the emptiness of a space that was previously occupied and is now not, that has not yet been genuinely inhabited by what the person's own life actually contains. The dynamic was consuming, its consumption was real, and the interior that spent significant resources on its maintenance does not immediately know what to do with the resources when the maintenance is no longer required. This is normal, is not the evidence that the dynamic was necessary or that the consumption was the interior's natural state. It is the honest experience of transition, of a self that is relearning what it is without the organizing presence of the dynamic as its primary background concern. The relearning takes time, more time than the acute phase of the transition suggests it will. The first weeks of genuine mutual silence tend to have a specific, slightly disorienting quality, precisely because the interior is genuinely unoccupied in a way it has not been for the duration of the dynamic. What fills the space gradually, organically, without the effortful project of deliberately finding things to replace the dynamic, is the actual content of the actual life, not as the dramatic discovery of a richer existence that was always there, waiting, as the quiet, incremental, unremarkable return of genuine engagement with what is genuinely present. The work that deserves fuller attention receives it. The friendships that were maintained at reduced presence receive more. The interests that were backgrounded become slightly more foreground. The interior that was partially externally directed becomes more genuinely self referencing. None of this is dramatic. None of it produces the specific emotional intensity of the dynamic's active phase. It has a different quality entirely, quieter, more genuinely nourishing in the specific way that things that are actually for the person tend to nourish, without the particular cost that things organized around someone else's availability tend to extract. The avoidant in the mutual silence is also discovering something, different from what the empath is discovering, more uncomfortable in specific ways that the empath's discovery tends not to be. The avoidant is discovering what the defended life actually contains when the empath's investment is genuinely not supplementing it. What it actually produces without the compensating presence. What the self-sufficiency feels like when it is genuinely on its own, rather than quietly supported by the background reassurance of someone else's genuine orientation. That discovery tends not to be comfortable. The defended life without the supplement tends to reveal more clearly than the defended life with it that the self-sufficiency was always partly the management of genuine need, rather than the genuine absence of it. But whether that discovery produces genuine engagement with what it reveals, or whether it is managed into new forms, is, as has been said throughout, entirely the avoidant's own. The shock is this. After all of the analysis of the avoidant psychology, the architecture, the genuine bonding, the insufficient expression, the gap between interior and behavior, the failed predictions, the management's new forms, after all of it, the most significant thing the mutual silence produces is not information about the avoidant. It is the genuine encounter with yourself, with what is actually here when the dynamic is not organizing the interior, with what the life actually contains when the resources return from their long outward allocation, with the specific, real, not requiring any particular external resolution quality of a self that was always genuinely there and is now, in the quiet of the mutual silence, simply more available to be inhabited than it was during the consuming phase of the dynamic. That is the shock, not the avoidance behavior, not what happens next between the two of you, what happens in you, what you find when the quiet is genuinely quiet. And what you find is real, was always real, simply requires the quiet to be heard. The mutual silence provides the quiet. What you do with what you hear in it is entirely, completely, without condition, yours. In the ordinary days, that are the whole of it, the quiet of the mutual silence has specific content. That is worth starting with honestly, rather than moving immediately into the psychological territory that this conversation has been occupying throughout. Because the genuine quiet, the actual felt daily texture of a period when both people have stopped reaching, is not primarily a psychological event, is primarily a lived experience, happening in the body, in the specific quality of Tuesday mornings and Sunday evenings, and the ordinary hours that do not have particular significance except that they are being lived through. And the living through them has a different quality than it had when the dynamic was consuming the background attention. What that different quality actually feels like deserves honest description, not the elevated, insight-rich language of psychological examination, the plain, accurate language of what is actually experienced. In the early period of genuine mutual silence, many people feel less than they expected to feel. Not numb exactly, not the protective absence of feeling that acute shock produces. Something more like the specific, quiet, slightly disorienting absence of the particular emotional weather that the dynamic was generating. The dynamic had its own emotional climate, the specific combination of hope and uncertainty and occasional genuine warmth, and the particular quality of loving someone whose availability was always slightly conditional. That climate was uncomfortable in many ways, but it was also present, had a specific texture, generated the kind of low-level emotional engagement that kept the interior activated in ways that, however costly, were also somewhat alive. The mutual silence removes that climate, and the interior, accustomed to the activation the dynamic was providing, finds the quieter conditions of the silence slightly foreign at first, slightly less alive in the specific way of something familiar being absent rather than in the way of genuine emptiness. This tends to be temporary, but it deserves honest acknowledgement rather than the immediate reframing of the quiet as the positive condition it eventually becomes. The early quiet can feel like loss before it feels like space, can feel like something missing before it feels like something opening. Both are honest experiences. The sequence matters and should not be skipped over. After the early period, and the timeline varies genuinely from person to person, cannot be predicted or prescribed, something begins to shift in the quality of the quiet. It becomes less about the absent dynamic and more about what is actually present. This shift is gradual and nonlinear, does not happen on a schedule, does not arrive because sufficient time has passed and the person has adequately processed what needed to be processed. It arrives organically, through the continued honest inhabitation of the ordinary days, as the interior's attention gradually, naturally, without effort, orients toward what is actually here rather than toward the absent what was there. The actual present of the ordinary days is worth describing plainly. It contains the specific people in the person's life, the friendships that were maintained at reduced presence, the family relationships that were continued at partial capacity, the colleagues and acquaintances, and the specific human beings who were actually in the person's daily life, rather than existing primarily in the context of the dynamic's emotional weather. It contains the specific work the person does, whatever form that takes, the actual tasks, the actual engagement, the actual texture of what is done with the hours of the working day. This content is genuinely there, regardless of the dynamic status, was there throughout, simply received less than its full share of the person's available attention when the dynamic was consuming a significant portion of it. It contains the person's own interior life, the specific quality of their own thinking, their own genuine interests, the particular things that engage them when they are genuinely available to be engaged, the books they actually want to read, the problems they actually find interesting, the creative or intellectual or spiritual territory that is genuinely theirs and that they find genuinely nourishing when they have genuine access to it. All of this was present throughout the dynamic. The mutual silence does not create it, simply makes it more available by reducing the allocation of the interior's resources elsewhere. The making more available is not uniformly pleasant. That is worth being honest about. Some of what becomes more available when the dynamic's climate is removed is material the person was not fully attending to during the dynamic, precisely because the dynamic was providing sufficient emotional occupation to not require the person to sit with it. Grief that was not fully processed, questions about the self that were easier to defer when the primary question was the dynamic's direction. The specific, personal, what do I actually want and am I building toward it questions that genuine interior honesty eventually requires, but that the dynamic's consuming presence was providing a convenient occasion to postpone. The mutual silence creates the conditions in which these questions become more insistent. Not because the silence actively generates them, because the silence removes the occupation that was making their deferral manageable. This is not a problem with the silence. It is the honest work the silence makes available. The specific, necessary, only happens when there is genuine space to do it work of genuine self-examination that the dynamic was inadvertently preventing. The genuine self-examination that the mutual silence makes available tends to produce specific recognitions that deserve honest attention. Recognition of patterns that preceded the avoidant, the specific ways the person's own relational history, their own attachment experiences, their own early learning about what love looks like and what it requires and how it tends to end, contributed to the shape of the dynamic. Not as the assignment of blame to the self, as the honest, clear-eyed acknowledgement that the person brought their own patterns to the encounter, as the avoidant brought theirs, and that the dynamic was shaped by both. This recognition is not comfortable. requires the specific, self-implicating honesty of someone who is genuinely examining their own contribution, rather than simply examining the avoidance. But it is genuinely useful in a way that examining the avoidance pattern alone is not, because the avoidance pattern belongs to the avoidant, and the person cannot change it. Their own patterns belong to them, and they can, through genuine, honest engagement, develop a clearer understanding of them and a more conscious relationship with how those patterns operate in intimate dynamics. Recognition of what was genuinely nourishing in the dynamic versus what was activated but not nourishing. The dynamic had moments of genuine nourishment, genuine contact. The specific, real, both people actually present quality of the unguarded moments when the avoidance management was temporarily less efficient, and something real passed between them. Those moments were genuinely good, were the evidence of something real in the connection, are worth honoring as such, rather than dismissing in the retrospective cleaning up of what was not adequate. And the dynamic also had significant activation that was not nourishing. The specific, adrenaline adjacent quality of the uncertainty, the emotional engagement of the hoping and the interpreting and the monitoring for temperature change, the particular aliveness of something always slightly at stake. These were activating without being nourishing, were producing the felt sense of something significant happening without the actual, sustaining, genuinely for the person quality of something that was genuinely good for them. Distinguishing between those two, between what was genuinely nourishing and what was merely activating, is one of the more valuable recognitions the mutual silence makes possible. Because genuine nourishment and activation feel similar in the moment and are very different in their actual effects on the person over time. Genuine nourishment sustains, produces the specific, accumulating, increasingly rich quality of something that is genuinely good for the person. Activation depletes, produces the specific, gradually more exhausting quality of something that is engaging in the way that stimulants are engaging, intensely, temporarily, at the cost of resources that take longer to restore than the stimulation lasts. The dynamic had elements of both. The genuine contact was nourishing. The uncertainty and the hoping and the monitoring were activating. And the person who can honestly distinguish between those two elements is better equipped for subsequent connections, better able to recognize the difference between a connection that is genuinely nourishing and one that is primarily activating, and to make honest decisions about investment accordingly. Recognition of genuine desires that were being partially suppressed by the dynamic's organizing presence. The person who has been in the avoidant dynamic for a significant period has, in some form, been organizing a portion of their hoping and wanting around the dynamic's potential. The wanting of genuine reciprocal love has been, in some sense, attached to the specific person and the specific connection. The hoping has been the hoping for the gap to close, for the interior love to find adequate behavioral expression, for the connection to become what it always had the potential to be. In the mutual silence, that specifically attached wanting becomes available to be examined honestly. And what tends to be found is that the wanting is real, and the attachment to the specific form it has been taking is separable from the wanting itself. The wanting genuine reciprocal love is genuine, is the honest expression of something that does not require justification. The attachment to that wanting being fulfilled specifically through this connection and this person is the layer that the dynamic's consuming presence has been sustaining. When the attachment to the specific form loosens, when the mutual silence creates enough genuine space for the wanting to be felt without the specific attachment organizing it, the wanting becomes available in a cleaner, less specifically directed form, as the honest expression of what the person genuinely desires from intimate connection, rather than as the hoping for this specific connection to become adequate. That cleaner wanting has more genuine mobility than the specifically attached version, can orient toward the actual conditions of the actual life, rather than toward the specific, hoped-for resolution of the specific dynamic, can recognize genuine mutual presence when it appears in the ordinary life, rather than being primarily organized toward the question of whether it will appear through the specific channel of the specific avoidance development, None of these recognitions are guaranteed by the mutual silence. The silence creates the conditions. The person's own genuine engagement with what the conditions make available determines whether the recognitions actually occur. And genuine engagement is not effortless. Requires the specific, patient, honest with oneself quality of someone who is willing to sit with what the quiet actually reveals, rather than filling the quiet with the comfortable substitutes that require less genuine engagement. The comfortable substitutes are real and understandable. Busyness, new engagements that fill the space without requiring the honest examination of what the space contains. The premature declaration of having moved on before the genuine processing has occurred. The construction of a narrative about the dynamic and its meaning that provides comfort at the cost of accuracy. These substitutes are not wrong exactly. Sometimes genuine rest, genuine non-examining, just being, not requiring anything of the interior rest. It's what the person actually needs. And the filling of the quiet with comfortable things is the appropriate and honest response to genuine depletion. But at some point, the genuine engagement with what the silence contains becomes available and worth choosing, not as the obligation of someone who must extract every possible lesson from every difficult experience. As the genuine patient, this is actually interesting and worth attending to engagement of someone who is curious about their own interior and willing to sit with what honest attention reveals. The avoidant in the mutual silence is, as has been noted, doing their own thing with their own interior in conditions that are theirs to navigate. The surprise of the failed predictions, the management's new forms, the gradual exhaustion of those forms in conditions where the empath's compensating investment is genuinely not available to supplement the defended life. Whatever that produces belongs to the avoidant, is not the person's concern in the sense of requiring their attention or their orientation. What the person's concern is genuinely simple: the ordinary days, what they actually contain, what the genuine engagement with them is producing in the person's own interior, what is being discovered in the space that the mutual silence is making available. That is the content of the person's life right now. Real, present, genuinely theirs, not organized around the avoidance interior process, not waiting for a particular resolution. Simply the actual texture of the actual days being actually lived by an actual person who has done genuine work and is continuing to do it, and is finding, in the doing, that the ordinary days have more genuine content than the dynamic's consuming presence was allowing to be fully visible. That is not a small thing, is in fact the whole of the thing. The ordinary days, with their actual content, and the person genuinely present to them, completely, right now. That is what happens next. Not the dramatic revelation, not the shocking return. The quiet, real, genuinely yours discovery of what the ordinary days actually contain when you are genuinely in them, which turns out to be considerable, more than the dynamics weather was allowing to be felt. Enough. Always enough. Right here, in the ordinary days, that have always been the whole of it. The genuine content of the ordinary days does not announce itself dramatically. That is worth starting with plainly. Because after a dynamic that had the specific, charged, emotionally weather-generating quality of the avoidant connection, with its characteristic intensity of hoping and interpreting, and the occasional genuine contact that justified the continued investment, the ordinary days can feel, initially, almost too quiet, too undramatic, insufficiently significant relative to what the interior had been calibrated to engage with. That calibration is worth examining honestly, because the intensity the avoidant dynamic generated was real, and it was also, in significant part, the intensity of uncertainty, rather than the intensity of depth. The specific aliveness of something always slightly unresolved, the engaged quality of an interior that was perpetually working on the question of the dynamic's direction. That kind of engagement is not the same as the engagement of genuine depth. It's the engagement of chronic low-level anxiety wearing the clothing of meaningful relational experience. And the person who has been calibrated to it for a significant period has, in some sense, developed a tolerance for it, has come to associate that quality of interior engagement with the feeling of being in something real and significant. The ordinary days without that calibrated intensity feel initially like less, like the diminishment of something, like the interior running at lower than its accustomed level of engagement. But the comparison is misleading. The accustomed level was not the depth it felt like. It was the output of a system that was perpetually working on something that required perpetual working on. The genuine engagement of the ordinary days, quieter, more settled, less acutely demanding of the interior's resources, is not the diminishment of depth. It is the beginning of a different relationship with what depth actually is. Depth in the genuine sense is not the same as intensity. This distinction is worth sitting with, because it is one of the more practically important things the mutual silence makes available to be genuinely understood. Intensity is the quality of experience when the stakes feel high and the outcome is uncertain, and the interior is engaged with the question of what is going to happen. Intensity can be produced by genuinely deep things and by genuinely shallow things alike. Can be the product of genuine love and genuine risk and genuine stakes. Can equally be the product of chronic uncertainty about another person's availability. The feeling of intensity is not the reliable indicator of depth. Depth is something quieter, is the quality of experience when what is present has genuine substance, when the engagement is with something that has real content, rather than with the question of whether the real content will ever be adequately expressed. When the connection has genuine roots, rather than the adrenaline of uncertain availability. When the interior is engaged with the actual substance of a relationship, rather than with the management of hope and the interpretation of insufficient signals. The avoidant dynamic had moments of genuine depth, the unguarded contact, the specific moments when the genuine interior was briefly in touch with the genuine interior of the avoidant, and something real passed between them. Those moments had depth, were the evidence of something real. And the dynamic also had enormous quantities of intensity that was not depth. The hoping, the monitoring, the sustained investment in the question of the gap's closure. This was intense, was engaging, was the kind of interior activity that can feel, from the inside, like the experience of something deeply significant. Distinguishing between depth and intensity, developing the honest, embodied, felt capacity to tell the difference between the two, is part of what the mutual silence eventually makes possible. The ordinary days teach this distinction better than any analysis of it can, because the ordinary days present actual depth without the intensity that the avoidant dynamic was using to simulate it. The genuine friendship that has been present throughout, not the excitement of uncertain availability, but the steady, warm, this person is actually here quality of someone who shows up without requiring monitoring. The specific depth of a long-known friendship is quieter than the intensity of the avoidant dynamic, does not produce the same quality of acute interior engagement, is also, in the honest assessment of what it actually provides over time, considerably more genuinely sustaining. The work that has genuine meaning, the specific, settled quality of being engaged with something that matters in the way work can matter, not acutely, not with the charged quality of something at stake, but with the genuine, accumulating satisfaction of someone who is doing something real with the hours of their actual life. The creative or intellectual engagement that is genuinely absorbing. The specific, self-forgetful quality of being completely occupied by something interesting, which produces a form of aliveness that is entirely different from the aliveness of the avoidant dynamic's intensity, but is no less real, is more genuinely the person's own, is not organized around another person's availability or the interpretation of insufficient signals. These forms of genuine depth, quiet, present, available in the ordinary days, are what the mutual silence makes more accessible. Not by creating them, they were always there, by reducing the allocation of interior resources toward the dynamic's intensity, which was consuming the resources that genuine depth requires for its full inhabitation. There is something honest worth saying about the avoidant at this point in the conversation. Not to maintain the orientation toward their interior as the primary concern, but because this conversation has examined their psychology extensively, and something would be missing from the complete picture if it were not said. The avoidant, in the mutual silence, is also in the ordinary days, their ordinary days, with whatever actual content those days contain. And those days are quieter than the active dynamics days in a different way than the empath's days are quieter. The empath's quiet is the relief-tinged, gradually more spacious quiet of someone whose resources are returning. The avoidance quiet tends to have a different texture, more the specific, hollow quality of someone whose defended life is revealed, in the genuine absence of the empath supplementing investment, to be somewhat less adequate than the self-sufficiency narrative was claiming. Not dramatically hollow. The avoidant is not in crisis. The management is running, the defended life continues to function. But function and flourish are not the same thing. And the avoidant's ordinary days in the mutual silence tend to have more of the specific, low-level, not quite adequate quality of functioning without flourishing than the narrative was previously able to acknowledge. That quality is honest information. Is the interior's genuine assessment of the defended life's adequacy being provided more directly than the compensating presence was previously allowing? Whether the avoidant receives that information honestly, whether the interior's genuine assessment of not quite adequate is allowed to become the genuine questioning of the premises that genuine reckoning requires, belongs entirely to the avoidant. The person's ordinary days continue regardless. With their own specific content, their own genuine texture, their own honest forward motion that does not require any particular development in the avoidance interior to be what it is. And in those ordinary days, something is slowly, genuinely, non-linearly developing that is worth naming honestly, even if not dramatically. The person is becoming more completely themselves, not as the project of self-improvement, not as the deliberate construction of a better version, but as the natural, organic, this is what genuine inhabitation produces consequence of someone whose considerable interior is increasingly genuinely available to themselves. The depth that was always genuinely present, the authentic capacity for genuine connection, the real warmth, the specific quality of someone who loves without the performing of love, that depth is finding more genuine expression in the actual life, in the actual friendships, in the actual work, in the actual engagement with the actual content of the actual days. This expression does not look dramatic, does not announce itself, is simply present in the gradually increasing quality of genuine inhabitation, in the specific, accumulating. This is what a genuinely lived life feels like, texture of days that are actually being lived rather than organized around the question of someone else's availability. That texture is the whole of what the mutual silence ultimately produces in the person who genuinely inhabits it, not the resolution of the dynamic, not the confirmation that the work was worth it through the arrival of a particular relational outcome. Simply the actual life, more fully inhabited, more genuinely present to its own content, more honestly available to what is actually here rather than what was hoped for or waited for, or organized around. The ordinary days, more completely the person's own. That is not a small thing, is, in the most honest assessment, the most genuinely valuable thing the mutual silence can produce. Not the avoidance eventual return, not the confirmation of anything about the connection. The person's own genuine life, more fully theirs than it was before, in the ordinary days, that are the whole of it, and always have been. The mutual silence continues doing its quiet work. Not dramatically, not with the specific, charged quality of something significant happening that both people will later identify as the turning point, simply continuing, day by day, in the unremarkable texture of two people who are both in their own lives, both navigating their own interior conditions, both living the ordinary days that belong to each of them separately now, rather than being organized around the shared dynamic that was consuming both. What happens in the empath's ordinary days during this continued quiet is worth describing plainly, without the elevated psychological framing that this conversation has been using extensively. Just plainly. Some days are fine, genuinely fine. Not the performed fine of someone who is managing their emotional presentation, but the actual, unremarkable, nothing particularly significant is happening fine of a Tuesday that is simply a Tuesday. Work gets done. Food gets eaten. Time passes in the ordinary way of time passing when nothing particular is demanding the interior's acute engagement. Some days are harder. The missing arrives without warning. The specific, particular, named quality of someone's absence pressing itself into an otherwise ordinary moment. Not as crisis, as the honest, human, this was real acknowledgement that genuine feeling does not resolve on a convenient schedule. Both kinds of days are real. Both are the actual texture of genuine life being genuinely lived, rather than the performed version of either suffering or recovery. The honest account of what continues to develop in the empath during the extended mutual silence is simpler than this conversation's extensive psychological examination might suggest. The person continues to know themselves more accurately, not through dramatic insight, through the accumulated, ordinary, this is what I actually like, and this is what I actually need, and this is what genuinely matters to me, quality of genuine self-knowledge that develops through genuine inhabitation of genuine experience over time. They continue to show up for their own life, not heroically, simply consistently, in the unremarkable, nobody is noting it way of someone who keeps engaging with what is actually present because what is actually present is genuinely worth engaging with. They continue to feel what they feel without requiring the feeling to mean something definitive. The missing is allowed to be missing without being converted into the evidence that waiting is warranted. The genuine love is allowed to be genuine without being converted into the instruction to remain available. The grief is allowed to move at its own pace, without being hurried into resolution or prolonged into the identity of someone who is still primarily defined by the dynamic. The avoidance interior continues its own process, whatever that process actually is, the management finding new forms, the gradual exhaustion of those forms, the preliminary softening toward genuine honesty, or none of the above, continues on its own terms, in its own conditions. The honest acknowledgement here is that this conversation has spent considerable attention on the avoidance psychology, has examined the architecture, the bonding signals, the going crazy, the failed predictions, the management's new forms, the exhaustion threshold, the preliminary softening. All of that examination is genuine and reasonably accurate as psychological description. It is also examination that, held too closely, can perpetuate the very orientation toward the avoidance interior that genuine reclamation is supposed to release. The person who has genuinely returned to themselves is not primarily occupied with the detailed psychological examination of the avoidance interior process, is not tracking the management's efficiency or the preliminary softening's arrival or the exhaustion threshold's approach, is living their life. That simple, that complete. What the continued ordinary days produce, over sufficient time, is a gradual but genuine shift in how the person holds the entire experience. Not a dramatic reframing, not the sudden everything makes sense clarity of insight arriving fully formed. The gradual, honest, lived into understanding of something that can only be genuinely known through the living of it, rather than the thinking about it. The understanding that the ordinary days were always the point, not the destination after the dynamic's resolution, not the consolation for the connection's insufficiency, not the what you have while waiting for something more significant to arrive. The actual thing, the substance of the actual life, the whole of what is genuinely available and genuinely real and genuinely worth the full quality of genuine presence. This understanding does not arrive as a conclusion, It arrives as the lived experience of having genuinely inhabited the ordinary days long enough that their actual quality becomes directly known, rather than theoretically accepted. The work, the friendships, the interests, the specific, particular, genuinely engaging content of a life that is actually being lived by someone who is actually present to it. These are not lesser than the intense, emotionally consuming quality of the avoidant dynamic. They are different in kind, more genuinely sustaining, more honestly the person's own. The love that the person is capable of, the genuine, sustained, not contingent on adequate return love that the dynamic demonstrated they carry, continues to be available, is not locked up waiting for the right recipient, is expressed in whatever forms are genuinely available in the ordinary life. In how the person shows up for the people who are actually present, in the quality of attention brought to genuine friendship, in the care extended toward the work, in the honest, warm, fully present quality of someone whose capacity for genuine love is not diminished by having been given to someone who could not fully receive it. That capacity is real, is not waiting for romantic love to make it real, is expressing itself continuously in the ordinary days. And what it meets in those ordinary days? The genuine reciprocity of actual friends, the genuine satisfaction of meaningful work, the genuine engagement of genuine interest is real too. Not the same as romantic love, not a substitute for it. Real, in its own right. Worth showing up for completely, in the ordinary days, that continue to be exactly what they have always been. The whole of the thing, right now.